Hey sixth graders, welcome to Language Arts. For most of you, this video is going to be a review. You should already have these things in your notes. It wouldn't hurt you to watch it and go over it again, but these are some of the things that you're going to need to know, to have in mind as we read Phoebe and the General. Phoebe and the General is in your textbook, your literature book, and it starts on page 16 in your book. These are a few things that you're going to want to know. I've put on Google Classroom a note outline for you to use if you don't already have these in your spiral notebook that you have for notes. You should, and most of you do, I think, but just in case, let's go over these things one more time. So the first thing we want to talk about is fiction versus nonfiction. Fiction is a story that is made up. It's not true. It's out of the author's imagination. So a lot of what you would see in the library would be fiction, right? My library here in my classroom over here, I've got 2 shelves worth of fiction. The Hunger Games is fiction. Lord of the Rings is fiction. There's realistic fiction. There's fantasy, sci-fi. There's all kinds of different kinds of fiction, different genres of fiction. But a fiction story is a story that is not true. It's made up by the author. So nonfiction, you can figure that one out, right? Nonfiction means it is true. It's not fiction. It is something that is meant to convey facts. My bookshelf over here on this side of my room is my nonfiction bookshelf. And that's where you have books of history, books of science, the Guinness Book of World Records. Some of those are pretty hard to believe, but they're true. They are nonfiction. So we're going to be reading some of both of those things this year. Phoebe and the General is fiction, but it is a specific type of fiction called historical fiction. Now, a lot of Phoebe and the General comes from real life events, but this is what the author thinks might have happened. So this is historical fiction. And historical fiction is, as I have written here, a piece of fiction that contains some facts, but not everything in the story is true. So when you're reading historical fiction, you've got to be very, very careful to not take it all in as true, because some of the things in it may not be true. I have a series of books that I have in my library at home that I read as an adult about the different leaders of the Roman Empire, and it's actually fiction, but a lot of it's true because the author did all of her research and she wrote about the lives of these famous leaders of ancient Rome, but there's a lot of holes in there. There's a lot of information we don't know about them, and so what she did with that was she used her imagination and made things up. So when you're reading those, you've got to be careful when you're reading a good piece of historical fiction. There's going to be a lot in it that's true. So you've got to use your brain and remember that not everything in it is true. And if you decide you want to figure out how much of the story is true and how much isn't, that's when you start doing research and looking things up. Phoebe and the General is historical fiction. Now, you've probably finished reading it by now. If you haven't, you need to. And so you've noticed that, and we talked about this a little bit in class last week, that some of the characters are real people. Phoebe Francis was a real person. Obviously, George Washington was a real person. And so when you're reading historical fiction, if it's really well written, you're going to have a hard time separating out the truth from the fiction. So you're going to want to pay attention to that. Foreshadowing. Now, Phoebe and the General is a little bit of a mystery. And in mystery stories, and actually in many different kinds of fiction, you're going to see foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is a writer's use of hints or clues to suggest events that will happen later in the story. You don't always recognize foreshadowing when it's happening, but sometimes when you finish reading a book or a story, you're like, oh, that makes so much sense now. And when you go back and reread it, or with a movie, you rewatch it, and you'll see those clues as you're going along, and you're like, oh, that makes so much sense now. I didn't know why they put that in there, and now I do. It was foreshadowing. It was a clue as to what was going to happen. Characterization. Characterization is very important in both literature and in drama, in plays and in movies, TV shows, that kind of thing. Characterization is the way the writer creates and develops the personalities of the characters, the people who populate the story. And so if you've got really good characterization, you're going to really relate to the character. You're going to understand their motivations. You're going to know a little bit about them. And there are 4 main ways. I wrote types on the worksheet, but it's really ways. 4 main ways or avenues of characterization that an author can take. Now, you could get more specific with some of these things, but we're just gonna have the 4 main ways. And the 4 main ways to do that are description. So you're going to describe a character. So if I had a character and I wanted to tell you what he looked like, you know, I would say Mrs. Hanson was a middle-aged woman with brown hair that had streaks of gray in it, right? That's a description of Mrs. Hanson. Or, you know, an author might say Mrs. Hanson was kind of loud and she liked to sing a lot. Now that doesn't describe how I look, but it describes my personality a little bit. And anybody who's ever been in my class knows, yes, Mrs. Hanson is loud, and yes, she likes to sing. So that's a direct description of the character. A second way that you can develop a character is by showing that character's actions. So what does that character do? Are they kind in their dealings with other people? Are they quiet? Do they sneak around? What are the things that they're doing? Pay attention to a character's actions and you can learn a lot about a character. The third thing is dialogue. Dialogue is when 2 or more people are having a conversation. And you can, when you're reading a book or watching a movie, you're kind of an eavesdropper almost, right? You're listening in on somebody else's conversation. Now they're fictional people, so it doesn't matter quite so much. But you're listening in and their dialogue can tell you a lot about them. What kind of words do they use when they talk to people? You can tell often if a character is well educated or if they're not well educated. You can tell sometimes based on if the writer writes the words out with an accent. You can tell, like for instance, if a character used the word y'all, you might know that that character was from the southern United States, because in the northern United States they don't use that word as much, right? So dialogue can tell you some things about character. And lastly, thoughts. Some characters will give you a glimpse into, or some authors will give you a glimpse into what their characters are thinking. They'll tell you what their thoughts are in any given moment, and that can help you learn all about a character, who a character is, what their motivations are, what they're doing. Now let's move over this way. I went ahead and wrote these out ahead of time because it makes the video a little bit shorter if I do that. So, theme. This is really important. Some works of literature, you don't need to worry about this quite so much. They're just there to enjoy. Sometimes I think about Shel Silverstein's poems, right? They're just funny and silly and just there to enjoy. And some stories are like that too. But often with a short story or a novel, there's some kind of big idea that the author is trying to get across using this story as the vehicle. So your theme. The theme of a story is the underlying message about life or human nature that an author, the writer, wants the reader to understand. It's the big idea. What's the big idea? In Phoebe and the General, and you're going to want to write this down. I didn't write this on the board, but it is on this worksheet if you're doing that. Or if you're double checking your notes along with this video, you can make sure it's in there. The 2 main themes for Phoebe and the General are trust and courage. And I won't always tell you the themes ahead of time, but for this one I will, because as you're reading it, I want you to keep those things in mind as you're reading it. So trust and courage, those are the 2 big things. Who can you trust, and do you have the courage it takes to do what's right? Phoebe and the General also have and many works of literature will have these in them. Metaphor and simile. Metaphor and simile are two kinds of figurative language. Figurative language is language that's not meant to be taken literally. So if I say, if I haven't seen you in a year and I see you and you've grown 3 inches, I might say, wow, you're growing like a weed. Now, you're not actually growing like a weed. You're growing like a person. But I use that as figurative language to show how surprised I am at how much you've grown. So, metaphor and simile are two kinds of figurative language. They are related. A metaphor is a figure of speech that makes a comparison between two things that are basically unlike. That means they're not the same, but they have something in common. A metaphor does not use the word like or as. So for instance, I think I used this example in class. If someone has brown eyes, you might say that their eyes are chocolate. Now their eyes are not chocolate. You're not going to rip out their eyes and eat them because they're yummy. That would be weird and gross and horrible, right? But we use that to describe somebody with brown eyes. I have brown eyes, right? And so we might say their eyes are pools of melted chocolate. That sounds a little bit silly, but it's a good example. A metaphor does not use the word like or as, and that is literally the difference between a metaphor and a simile. A simile is almost exactly the same as a metaphor, but it does use like or as. So if you've got really blue eyes, I might say, your eyes are as blue as a summer sky. Now you see I've used the word as, which changes that from a metaphor to a simile. Now, I did not have room to get everything written on the board, so now I'm going to grab my eraser and I'm going to erase some of this. So if you need a little more time to copy this down, you can always go back in the video and pause it at a spot where you can see everything, and then you can get everything written down. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this because we are going to talk very quickly about the plot pyramid. Now you're going to use this for many of the things we are going to study this year, the plot pyramid. Now the plot of a story is basically just the events that happen, right? What happens in the story? That's the plot. So the plot pyramid. The plot pyramid is kind of a way to graph the plot of a story. Now this is the basic plot pyramid. It's a little bit different for every story. Let me show you what I mean. Obviously it's going to be in the shape of a pyramid, right? You're going to have a base, and then it's going to go up, and then it's going to go down, and you're going to have another base. So how does the plot pyramid work? Here is how it starts. It starts out over here with the exposition. The exposition. This is the setup, right? We're getting everything set up. This is where you learn who the characters are, what the setting is, where it takes place, when it takes place, all of that. Then you have the rising action. That's this. The rising action is sort of like if you've ever been on a roller coaster and you get in, right? You get in and you get buckled, and that's the exposition. You're figuring it out. The rising action is all of the events that kind of bring you up to the top, to the main point. So if you're in the roller coaster, you're going up, right? And you get to the top, and that's what we call the climax. The climax of the story. This is the big kaboom, if you will. The climax is the turning point in the story. It's where the story, everything changes. Whatever that point is, everything changes. And then you have this way, the falling action. It's always harder for me to write down this side than it is the other side, and I don't know why. The falling action. this is sort of the fallout or the repercussions of the climax. The falling action is any event that occurs after the climax. And then the last thing we have is the resolution. This is where everything ends and everything's tied up into a neat little bow. Now, sometimes you'll get a novel or a story without a resolution, and we generally call those cliffhangers because then there's going to be something else, right? For instance, the Hunger Games or the Lord of the Rings or the Harry Potter books, all of these different books that are a series, they will often leave the book at a sort of at a hanging point where some things are resolved but not everything is resolved, and we call that a cliffhanger. So this is how stories, how a plot generally works. Now sometimes the rising action is shorter, sometimes the falling action is shorter. It won't always be exactly the same number of events rising as it is falling, but we're just doing that as a basic idea of how that works. And that is what I want you to know as you're reading Phoebe and the General. And I will be putting on Google Classroom this video as well as some discussion questions for Phoebe and the General that I would like for you to read and think about as you're reading. When we get back from being at home because of the smoke. So the next time we're all together, I want you to be ready to talk about Phoebe and the General in class with me and with each other. So as you read, be sure to read those discussion questions, and we'll all go over them together when we get back. And I am really excited and looking forward to that. So I will see you soon.